Well, guys, this is the penultimate lesson. Next week is it. Lesson 38 tonight. We're looking at the last part of chapter 15, verses 33 through 47. This is really more account, if you will, but we're going to have an opportunity to delve into some pretty interesting spiritual aspects of this as well tonight. I know Preston's chomping at the bit, at least for one piece. You better be, because I'm going to be calling on you, brother. I got to tell you. So we'll see how that goes. But again, as often these are, this is just broken into two major chunks. We see first off Jesus' death on the cross, and then we see immediately following that his burial. So let me read verses 33 through 41 as we finish up the account of Jesus on the cross. Now, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of those who stood by when they heard that said, look, he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink, saying, let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come and take him down. Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and of Joseph, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So mechanically speaking, we see here that it's from the 6th hour to the 9th hour that there's darkness. So 6th hour, that's noon. So 9th hour, 3 p.m. Not normal that you would have darkness in the middle of the day like that. And there's been a lot of conjecture about it. You'll note if you go look at the other gospel accounts, nobody says why. They just report the fact that there's darkness from noon to 3 p.m. And so it's been asked, what could have caused that? And of course, the first thing that people will say is an eclipse. But I hope you guys realize, number one, that eclipses don't last 3 hours. If you've been through a total eclipse of the sun, it lasts, a few minutes, but nowhere near 3 hours, first and foremost. Second of all, it's impossible for there to be an eclipse at this time of the year because the Passover would have occurred during what? Astronomically speaking. Don't go too far out there.
Spring?
No, astronomically speaking. What would be hanging in the sky during the Passover? Yeah, and what phase would he be in? What phase would the moon be in?
The hangnail.
The hangnail. No, it's not the hangnail. It'd be the full moon. It'd be a full moon, right? The festival would be during the full moon.
Instead of the hangnail.
And I mean, so I mean, just think logically. You cannot have a solar eclipse when you have a full moon because the sun's on the wrong side, right? Mm-hmm. When you have a full moon, the sun is shining on the moon. So the sun's over there. You with me? There's no way that you could do that. You just can't do that. Yeah. So it just can't happen. So it had to be something supernatural, right? Now, what's interesting, and all of this passage is not necessarily about this, but if you look back at Amos chapter 8, verse 9 and 10, you can see that this was not a surprise to the Lord. Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Amos.
I'm there.
I have to do that for myself.
Okay.
Yeah, I know them, but I don't always remember exactly where to jump in. So Amos 8, 9, and 10 says, and it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feast into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. I will bring sackcloth on every waist and baldness on every head, and I'll make it like mourning for an only son, and its end like a bitter day. Now, obviously, this is talking also about the day of the Lord, but you see that prophecy in verse 9 being fulfilled as well here with Jesus while he's crucified, that we have darkness in the land. And so 3 p.m., which should be the really brightest time of the day, it's the darkest. You can draw any conclusion you want to about that. It's been said that really, many people say, this is kind of a sign of the judgment that was coming, which kind of speaks to what Amos talks about. But at the end of that darkness, as that time concluded, we see Jesus crying out with this loud voice. And what he cries out in the Aramaic, and there's been some debate about it, he said part of it in Aramaic and part of it in Hebrew, or whatever. I'm not going to get into all the jot and tittle about all of that tonight. But the point is, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, those words, if you go back and look at Psalm 22, that's the first line of Psalm 22, which Preston has talked about. This is why I told you, you probably chomping at the bit, that this suggests what's known as remez. Anybody remember what, other than Preston, remember what remez is? We haven't talked about it nearly as much as your gang in Virginia has, but I'm hoping maybe somebody will remember what it is. Think logically about it. If it's the first line of the psalm, what might remez be?
Hickory dickory dock.
Huh?
Hickory dickory dock.
The mouse ran up the clock.
The clock struck 1.
I don't remember that.
Right. Hickory dickory dock. Right. A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
HIJKLMNOP. I know what you're trying to do.
I'm going to take a stab at it. It's something that would trigger them to know the rest of the verse.
Bingo. Right. If he had said 7 years ago, could have jumped on that, right?
Yeah.
Didn't want to go there. We'd have to remember the rest.
Nobody knows the Gettysburg Address. No.
How about, oh, say, can you see?
They don't know either.
No. Yeah, that's the mechanism. Preston, you want to kind of give an example on remez, because you've taught it quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, I think Christine's quite right, is that it's an entryway, or it's a tool to help remember a passage or training, a song, etc. But on top of that, it's understood to have a deeper meaning. And if Pastor makes me talk more about it, there's a group of people who believe that there's a treasure or a secret lining within the portion to be remembered.
You can say about as much about that as you want to.
So Pastor Bruce is saying I'm chomping at the bit. I'll be very, very sanguine and kind tonight, and I'm not going to be where Brother Trent is, where usually the parable of the soils, oh, there he is. Okay, well, so what I'll do is help you to know this. For many, many years, I've received and I've heard and I've been on the receiving end of sermons about this Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and it's meaning that Yahweh needed to turn away from Jesus because he can't countenance sin. And I embrace that quite regularly, and for most of my adult believer life, until I got to study this with Messianic Jews and their take and their understanding on this is quite different than the evangelical Christian.
So good lead in, because if you pick up almost any commentary, and I mean any commentary, they tend to point to the fact that many see this Jesus's declaration that it's about him experiencing for the first time in his life the alienation of sin, because he had taken the sin of mankind upon himself. So, did I lose you, Preston? Are you still there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay? I lost my camera.
Yeah, I see you lost your camera, but you got audio, so I just want to make sure you're hearing what's going on.
Yeah,
So,
still with you.
and typically where
Is Preston going to finish his story? I would like to know what the Jewish person's take on that verse is.
well, if it doesn't take too long, I've got a lot to talk about tonight.
Oh,
What do you think,
okay.
Preston? What do you think, Preston?
I was letting you lead
Give
and
us
then
the
come
clip notes.
I was letting you lead that, Pastor, and only filling in if and when I needed to.
Well, I may go a different place than you do, so we'll see, because I don't remember all of that. I will say this. Let me finish my part, and we'll kind of meld it together. There's a sense, and where the defenders of the idea of Jesus experiencing the alienation of sin comes from an Old Testament and a New Testament place. In Deuteronomy 21:23, where it talks about he who hangs on a tree is cursed of God. And he was definitely hanging on a tree, a little different aspect, but nonetheless, he was hanging on a tree. And then it speaks in Galatians 3:13 about the fact that Jesus took our curse upon himself. And so that's usually kind of the centering point, and probably those sermons that Preston's heard probably is where they kind of center up on that, because that's typically where they are. Now, the other idea with it being remez really speaks to the point that if you read all of Psalm 22, number one, you see the fulfillment, right? We talked about it last week. We talked about the fact that it predicts it prophesies that they're going to divide up his clothes, and he's encircled by dogs and all the other things that he goes through and if you guys have not read Psalm 22, I would encourage you to make that part of your study this week. But because Psalm 22 is we call a lament, right? Lament, Psalms are all through the Psalms. One of the interesting aspects of lament Psalms is there's always a point with which the psalmist talks about their hope in God. They always talk about how God is going to carry them through. And so even in the midst of the despair that they're going through, there's a hopefulness that comes from that. And so that's usually the counterpoint to the alienation, is to say, even though he was going through all of this, he knew that he had a future apart from this. So that's kind of my take on it, Preston. You want to fill in the blanks?
Tried to do this quickly, and I appreciate that Paula rang in the way that she did. So the regular Jews that are not Messianic believe that this is David lamenting because Saul is pursuing him.
Right.
Regular evangelical Christians believe that this is Yahweh turning his back on Jesus because Jesus is bearing the sins for mankind from Adam all the way until time is over. But that's not what Messianic Jews believe. Messianic Jews believe that this is Jesus pointing toward an element in Psalm 22 that we pay little attention to, because again, the Bible's written for us, but not to us. So the worm that's in Psalm 22 is the secret or the underlying message and treasure that the Messianic Jews understand is Jesus, because this particular worm has some presentation and some practices that perfectly describe that which Jesus does for mankind as a whole. So it sounds a little bit curious. You asked folks to read it for the week. I'll add more if we need to later. But the worm is where the Messianic Jews focus, because this worm and its behavior and practices are critical to understanding what Jesus is doing for us. They also believe that because Yahweh God is sovereign, and these are the Messianic Jews, that Yahweh God already knew that Jesus was going to do this. So he's fine in countenancing this because it was in his plan. So he's not turning his back on Jesus. He's not necessarily in the presence of that sin, kind of what the Bible teaches. He is not endorsing it, but he is recognizing that that's come to pass because that was the plan from eternity before.
And I think somewhere in between those two is where reality lies. I think there's room in there for both, quite frankly. So I'm going to kind of leave it there tonight. That I get where God knew it was going to happen. Nothing is a surprise to him. But the fact that Christ took the curse upon himself, what he experienced, I think it's less about the abandonment of God and just the experience of the alienation of the sin, taking the sin upon himself. I think it's a moderate view, as opposed to the idea that God couldn't look upon Jesus because he was on the cross, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It does, and thank you for that, Pastor Bruce. Let me make this point though. It's rarely understood and studied this worm that's referenced, its origins, its behaviors, and its practice. And if you actually do the work and you read through this week and perhaps look for some definition, this is where the Messianic Jews focus, because what this worm does and how it operates, it's incredibly special. And it does what it is that Jesus does. And in many ways, the Messianic Jews recognize that Yahweh's plan is coming to fruition because of this reference given back to David hundreds of years ago about what Jesus is going to do, because the worms and the worm's behavior and what he leaves in his wake is what Jesus does.
If you've got any references to that, send them along.
I will.
Yeah, I'd like to see that too.
Yeah, because I've always heard it taught the other way, that that the Father just couldn't look upon sin, and when Jesus took the sin of the world upon his shoulders, of course he could not see that.
Well, the reality is that he was our substitute. That's the
Right.
important thing we need to recognize. He became sin for us. He became our
Right.
substitute.
He
But-
became for us.
Yeah, I mean, he experienced the desolation of sin, but that, I think it may be taking us a little too far, possibly. I don't spend as much time on the worm as Preston does. I look more at the fact that when he said that, that anybody who knew Psalm 22 would recognize that what was going on right in front of them was prophesied, as Preston makes the point, 1,000 years before Christ. And I mean, and it's right there in front of them. So any Jew standing there that knew Psalm 22, when Jesus said that, they'd be able to put two and two together and say, well, God had planned this. God had planned this from the beginning. And to me, that's the part I kind of get into. So other questions or comments on that? Here or there? Welcome, Trent.
Howdy. I was going to say I felt conjured. I heard the parable of the sower mentioned and I appeared.
We don't do that in this church, my friend.
I know.
No conjuring. Nobody from Endor is going to show up. Nothing like that. I promise. So
I was going to mention on the Remez idea. You don't see both of the quotes here in Mark. You have to go to the other Gospels, but he finishes with Psalm 31:5.
Right.
And I kind of think that if you look at that entire sweep from Psalm 22 through Psalm 31, I think Gene has mentioned this before, you might as well just take that entire block together and just picture Jesus singing it straight through and getting everybody there in on the singing, and just the sermon quality of that episode, that scene, to say, look, yeah, this was David 1,000 years ago, but he had an experience of the lows and the highs of what's going on right here in front of you. This may seem devastating and horrifying, but think about what's going on right now.
Exactly.
And people should take hope from that.
Well said. Well said. Well,
Just as-
so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just as the quickest little item, just as another viewpoint, it's not just Remez of Psalm 22. It's not just God turning his back on Jesus because of the presence of sin, but think it a little bit to a Jewish mind in terms of a temple, right? Most of the Torah, most of the law is centered around purity in the effort to keep the temple pure, because that's where God came to meet the people and the people came to meet God. And so everything that's defined as sin throughout the law, and then all the examples through the rest of the Old Testament, demonstrate what happens when the sin of the people defiles the temple. Sometimes it leads to destruction of the temple, and then God calls back a restoration of the temple once the people are prepared for it. And Jesus called himself the temple, and I will tear down this temple and rebuild it, and all those ideas. And so the sin is not just God can't look at it. It's Jesus as a temple intentionally allowed the defilement of all of mankind to come upon himself. And then it was the overcoming power of God to restore that temple from that defilement 3 days later. And therefore, the way is opened for people to come meet their God again. So it's metaphorical and poetic, but there's kind of a layer of it in there, I think.
Might kind of tap up against that here in a few minutes. We'll see how it goes. Well, for what it's worth, whoever got it, there at least were some there that day that didn't get it at all. So they think he's calling for Elijah, and there was this idea that it was folklore, but it was kind of based on Micah, that Elijah was going to come back and help whenever he had a problem, kind of thing. Talk about conjuring. That kind of has that kind of sense to it there, and so it was it's more or less mocking is really what it was. And so they they said, well, let's give him some sour wine, and it's kind of a refreshing drink and kind of calm him down. And we talked about the idea of the sponge on the reed being maybe not the kind of thing you'd want to drink on, because that's kind of how we saw that in Italy, right? Herculaneum, right? In the bathroom you had the reed with the sponge, and it was kind of the common toilet paper. Basically, everybody used the same sponge. Just think through that. So not pretty, right? But that could have well been what this was that was stuck up in his face, and not nice. But
better than the medieval court jester.
Say again?
It was better than the later medieval court jester.
I don't know the reference. I'm sorry.
So you got to use the public xylospongium. In medieval times, the court jester, that was part of his job. For the royalty.
Nice. Okay. I'm not up on all that stuff, so thanks for that image. Appreciate that. So we see here as Jesus dies, he cries out with a loud voice. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So I'm going to kind of just bounce off that for right now. Mark records that the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And so there's been discussion about the fact there's actually two veils or curtains in the temple. And so which one was this? The outer veil the outer curtain was what was at the entrance into the temple, and there's been some conjecture about that, but I think the resounding evidence and the resounding opinion is that this inner veil, that this veil that was torn, is the inner veil that separated from the holy place, from the most holy place, where the Holy of Holies was. And really, biblically speaking, if you really want to get a sense of that, go read Hebrews, because Hebrews references our ability to now enter the most holy place, and so that kind of speaks to that. I gave you Hebrews 10:19 through 22. You can go read that one. There's several other references, one in chapter 6 and a couple of other places as well. And it seems from all that the writer of Hebrews writes that there's a definite sense that this veil that was torn from top to bottom, which is indicative of the fact that God did it, not man, and that this was the veil into the Holy of Holies that was torn. And people say, well, how'd that news get out? Well, people talk. And I can imagine that information would have gotten out pretty quickly. So, whatever conjecture you want to have on that. But again, the writer of Hebrews, I think if that were not the case, he maybe would have gone a little different place with that, for what it's worth. But what's interesting, and again, I'm gonna ask the question about this in a couple of minutes, is that Jesus is still strong at his death, right? I mean, he cries out with a loud voice and breathed his last, and that impresses the centurion, that he did this. And why? Well, crucifixion is basically asphyxiation. I mean, that's how you die. You're on there. You're nailed or tied to the crossbeam. You've got your feet nailed or tied to the upright, and there's a little seat, not a seat really, but it's a little bump out that they put right about where your rear end is, just to give you a place to kind of rest. But you're like that, and all of your lungs, your organs are all drooping, and in order to take a breath, you've got to pull up, which is where a lot of the pain comes from. When you pull up, right? Not to mention the fact you've been scourged, so your back's all shredded, and you have to pull up to just take a breath. And so typically when somebody died, they just kind of whimpered out and took the last kind of whimpering breath, and then they were dead, suffocated. And so for Jesus to cry out with a loud voice, that got the centurion's attention, quite frankly. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So there's that. And then finally, just before we get to the questions, note that in verse 40 and 41, who's there? Which one of his followers are noted? It's the women. The women. See, Mary Magdalene is there. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, which, if you triangulate that with the other gospel accounts, this is the mother of James and John. The one who'd come and said, "Would you put my boys on the right and the left?" Right? I mean, this is her. Her boys aren't there. Well, John had been, I guess. We think, from John's gospel, he'd kind of taken Mary off. But this is Jesus's aunt. It's kind of, we think the organization goes there. And so they're there as witnesses, and they would be witnesses. If you look at it, they're witnesses to his death. In the next section, we see that at least a couple of them are witnesses to his burial. And then they would be witnesses to his resurrection, not the actual resurrection, boom, but they were there to see the tomb was empty, is my point. We're going to ask that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But so going back to the centurion, he says, after he cries out with a loud voice, he says, "Truly this man was a son of God." How would you characterize that statement? Is that a statement of faith? Is it a statement of fact? Is it a statement of something else? What do you think? What do you think he meant by that? Because there's a lot of debate on this, quite frankly. And bonus point, can you connect this to something Old Testament that kind of has a similar ring to it? by a pagan? What do you think?
Well, a lot of actions that are taken that are directed because of God's account of what's going to take place. So a lot of things like Daniel and whatnot that have taken place come about because there's going to be words that follow that action that the Christian takes that either bless the Lord or acknowledge that God is superior to everything.
Okay.
So this would be a case where that files suit as well, where Jesus' action reveals a blessing through the words of someone who is not called a child of God, someone who is, I guess, just natural words in a sense.
Natural words.
Right.
As in, he doesn't really get it, but he knows it's something different. Is that kind of where you're heading with that?
Well, no, a lot of the times that we talking in the kingdom of the world, we're using natural terms and stuff like that. But this right here is like a kingdom of heaven words. Like, oh, truly, this man was the Son of God. Like, that's a kingdom of heaven words. So you bring in possibly what a natural, worldly person would be able to recognize that this is an action taken by a son of God. Yeah, someone superior.
Okay. All right.
And yeah.
So you would kind of fall on the side that he would see that maybe Jesus had some sort of deity about himself, some divineness about himself.
That he was in pursuit of accomplishing what was given to do. That's what I mean. So that's what was recognized. For Son of God, like God has a son and they're doing something. Like because he was doing this specific thing, it made it recognizable that it was from God. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so you feel like he was recognizing the act.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm tracking with it. All right. Other thoughts? Other thoughts?
Well, the centurion, I mean, his job was to read the signs of whether death was occurring or whether it had to be hurried along. And in the account that we just read, there was the sign of the darkness. And then if you read the account in Matthew, there's, all kinds of supernatural that happen. I mean, tombs open and dead people come out and, just a ton of things. So, I mean, I just think this guy read the signs and all of a sudden was given faith to say, I believe.
So you think it was a statement of faith?
Yeah.
You think there was a statement of belief?
Yeah, belief. That's a good word. Not faith, maybe. Belief.
Okay. All right. Other thoughts?
Probably coming from a position of fear. Because even if that was his statement of faith, he probably comes from a background, being Roman, of a pantheon, and gods have the habit of killing each other and bad things soon following. So if he believes that a god was just killed, he might be coming from his background,
All
a
right.
position of fear.
Yeah, I get you, because we know that to the Roman gods, humans were just kind of a plaything, right? So he may have wanted to be getting out of the way. All right, that's an interesting take. I'm with you. I'm tracking. Other thoughts?
I was going to throw regret into there.
In what regard?
Well, Paula started talking about signs, and I thought, oh, like the sign that's up over his head saying King of the Jews. This guy would have heard the entire proceeding and said, oh, well, King of the Jews is what the sign says. But the thing that got him thrown in the clinker was saying, yeah, I'm the Son of God.
Yeah.
That's what, the blasphemy charge was built on, and, that moved it all along from the Sanhedrin. So he would have heard that or heard about it just from the night before and said, oh, well, whoops, maybe we should have listened. Maybe we should have taken that a little more seriously. I mean, I think
Okay,
I think John's point about fear is good, but guess what? That's what everybody's reaction is when they actually see God's face.
Mhm.
Think about the Hebrews coming out of Egypt, and here's God on top of the mountain with all the thunder and clouds and stuff. What's their reaction? I don't want to go up there.
And we don't want to hear from you anymore either.
Yeah.
Just tell Moses. All right, so regret and fear.
Ooh,
What do you,
go ahead.
do you think that maybe that their fear was basically them becoming aware of the sin they had just committed?
Who's they?
The centurion.
Maybe in an immediate
What do
sense.
you think? What do you think?
I don't know.
I'm asking the question, so I want to hear what you got to say. Anybody else?
So, Pastor, I don't know if this is a saving, a salvific recognition. I think that in many ways this is here for us as an objective, scientific, factual pronouncement that this is a guy who's not religious. He's not a Jew. He's, like John said, of the Roman or Greek pantheistic background. Like Trent said, he may have been privy to a lot of what occurs to get Jesus' sign above him and to get Jesus on the cross. But here's the thing sometimes that we miss because we're just reading John, and you mentioned this earlier. This guy has been here. Now, he doesn't know that the dead are walking. He doesn't know that the temple curtain has been rent. He doesn't know that. What he does know that it's dark, but here's what he also knows. He's been here for the 7 statements that Jesus has issued from the cross. And he has listened to Jesus not retch, not profane anyone, and he has listened to Jesus converse with people at the foot of the cross and talk with his Father. And this guy, based on all of that objectivity, makes the summation that this is not a regular happenstance. This is something peculiar, and I need to acknowledge that. I don't know that this is salvific. I don't know that he has accepted that he's a sinner. He's accepted, though, like perhaps King Nebuchadnezzar, that this is not the usual happening.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm on the
My bonus point from the Old Testament. I was thinking of the rest of the crew on the boat with Jonah. They have the storm come up. They can't figure it out. Jonah says, "Yeah, it's me. Just kill me. Throw me overboard. It's my fault, guys." And they say, "Come on, that's ridiculous. Just say something to your God and it'll be fine." He says, "No, you need to throw me over." So they did, and the storm goes away, and they start worshiping God.
Okay.
They don't get it. They don't know hardly anything about God. They're probably Phoenicians, so that's just kind of casually familiar with those guys' God over there. Just like this Roman centurion knows something about what these Jewish people are talking about. It might be kind of ridiculous to him, but now he sees, something happened here, like you're saying.
Something big.
Maybe I should be interested in this. So yeah,
Okay.
I agree. It's not to the point of us saving faith, perhaps, but it's that first step. Like it's that, I do have a problem.
Okay. Blake, I'm going to let you weigh in last, and then I'm going to jump on. I thought you had something else.
Yeah, this is just the first account. God made man from the dust and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then what the centurion heard was his breath out of his body, returning back to Creator. And so that's just that's the simple, not digging into it
Okay.
very far, just that reference right there.
All right. That's a little different take on it. Let me try to give you guys a triangulation. Paula, you started this when you talked about the all the stuff that happened, the bodies coming out of the graves and all that sort of thing. And this kind of speaks to where John was, because in Matthew's parallel, and again, I told you guys, I don't go there unless it makes sense to do it. But in the parallel, after the veil of the temple was torn, which I agree with you, Preston, the centurion could not have known that at the point that all this was happening. I can't see how the centurion would know that the temple and the Holy of Holies was torn at the point that this was all happening. He would not have been privy to that. But we know that the darkness, we know the earthquakes that Matthew talks about, the bodies coming out of the graves. Did he know part of that? Perhaps he did. It says in Matthew 27:54, it says, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly. Okay. And I'm sure you guys got the Greek. I don't have it in front of me. I'm sure that's the reverent fear, it's probably phobos, but I'm not sure. Phobos, fear. That's the Greek word for fear. Probably that word, but we'll see. I think Trent's looking. So there's that. That's one piece of evidence. And then the other piece, and I'm cheating because I normally stay in Mark, but I'm cheating just because I want to try to triangulate on it, is we see in Luke where it says, chapter 23, verse 47. When the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. Right? So I'm not gonna try to do harmony of the gospel right now, but it just gives a different kind of spirit to it. My personal thought is that I don't believe this is saving faith. My parallel, and I thought you were going to go there because you were right bang up on it, was Daniel. When we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And in chapter 3 of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar had seen that. He said, didn't we cast 3 into the furnace? And then he says in verse 25, look, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, a lot of people think that should be a Son of God, but the point is that there seems to be a recognition where you started. There seems to be a recognition of some sort of divine, something other than humanity, right? I mean, there's definitely a sense of something there. Does it lead him to saving faith? We don't know that. We just don't know. We know that in Nebuchadnezzar's case, he got there eventually, but it took more than just that to get him there. It took a little more work on his part. So it's hard to say. If you want to line up and say, I think he believed in Jesus and came to salvation, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, because I can't definitively say that. But I do think there's a sense that there was an otherness to this that got his attention. And that, again, and that's kind of where Preston was, is that this is just a verifying witness that says this was amazing, and it did happen. And he caught it, to your point, he caught it at the tail end, at the completion of the task. He spoke out to that. So that's pretty phenomenal.
Is it significant? Were they pointing out because he's a Gentile? Like, is that why he's
just the fact that somebody who didn't really need to care about any of it?
Yeah, because
Right.
certainly he was the only one who did, but he's in here and he's a Gentile.
Well, I think where we have to get to, and again, it's looking at all the gospels. I mean, we don't see these other guys getting into the detail that John does, where the spear in the side and the water in the blood and the breaking of the bones and all that sort of thing. We don't see that in the synoptic gospels. They abbreviate that. John very much amplifies that out, and I think I included, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, what it speaks to is the fact that he was the closest witness to this thing. I mean, it was not smoke and mirrors. It was not a swoon. It was not some sort of a, spirit type thing. I mean, it was a real man who died a real death on the cross. But there was something different about him than who knows? I mean, how many different men had this centurion been responsible for crucifying? Do you think he would have got it wrong? No. And so, yeah, I think it's a major point that a disinterested, uninvolved Gentile makes this statement. Whether it led into saving faith, only God knows. But he's there to provide eyewitness testimony to not only the completion of the task, but Jesus was unique in the way he did it. I'd like to think, because it's recorded elsewhere, he says, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. I think is the way it's written. He could have lived longer. I think he just let it go. He was strong. He was still there. He let it go. It was different than perhaps the centurion had ever seen before.
Mm.
Like that.
And it's addressed to a audience, 20, 30 years removed in a city
Indeed.
far away. Maybe there's an element of you need two witnesses, and it's not enough for all these Jewish people to say it. You need Gentile people to say it too. So it's a cultural two witness thing.
Indeed. Well, to your point there, my friend. So what do we know? What should we learn from these women being witnesses? What do you think about that? What do we know about women being witnesses? First off,
They aren't.
right?
They weren't.
Legally, could two women come into a courtroom and say, "Well, we saw him"? No, they could not. They were inappropriate, unacceptable as witnesses. So, if that's the case, Mark makes a pretty big deal about that they're there and that they saw all of this. So, what should we learn from that? I think there's a New Testament lesson here.
This is one of those validations where Christianity shows the value of women. And when there's no Jew, there's no Gentile, there's no slave, there's no freeman, this is one of those distinctions that says they're people and they're of value, and that there are several of them, they're reliable.
Bingo. We see this touched on all through the Gospels and the book of Acts, and even into Paul's letters as well. I mean, when you see a woman being elevated like a Priscilla, you see a woman like Phoebe being elevated. When you see that when Paul finally makes it to Europe and he goes to Philippi, the first people that were there to worship with him were the women. The first person he led to Christ in Europe was a woman. And so, yeah, there's a validity, a validation, if you will. And I hate to use that word because too many people today come to church to be validated, and that's not where I'm at on that. But there's a validation of women that you are important to the kingdom of God. And that, just can't miss that. And they didn't have to write it. So I believe they put it there for a very real, a very kingdom purpose, that they're there. So I just wanted to make sure I said that out loud here in the midst of this. Now, in the same token, next week, I'm going to beat the heck out of the women who are in chapter 16 because it's just kind of the way the book ends. So I not physically, I'm not going to touch them, but they get a little bit of pushback from me next week. So, but I think the Lord is going to use them at the end of this book challenge us. So stay tuned. We'll get that next week. So for what it's worth. And I'm going to get you guys so stirred up next week. You're not even going to want to talk to me after this probably. So that's okay. So the Lord, yep.
Sorry, I think there's kind of it's a distant second answer here. That's it was a concern in the early church and less so now because we have scripture completed. But I mentioned it before that the early church was concerned with its own legitimacy,
Sure.
apostolic succession and stuff like that. They had to say this is the true teaching, not what those guys are saying over there. It's not just that there are several women and women are important, although that's the main thing, and it's a culturally constructive thing there. He names them. And he just throws out names. He's name dropping, Like, if I do it, then I look ridiculous. You don't actually know that guy. Come on. Right? You're just brown noser likes to hang out with rich people. No. These are women that his audience would know. And his audience is in Rome and probably some of the other cities that would get a copy of this letter at some point down the road, like a chain letter.
Right.
Well, like the tradition, for example, I think it's from Polycarp or Irenaeus or something, whoever it was, that Mary, Jesus' mother, did indeed travel around with John and ended up in Ephesus. John's there 90 AD still preaching, telling the whole story to his congregation, and there's Mary maybe in the front row. And it's like, see, she's sitting right here. I mean, does the math work? I don't know, but but
let's not try to work that out. That seems a little bit long, but yeah, okay.
And it might not have been 90 AD. It might have been like closer to 70 or whenever.
Maybe 70, yeah, because otherwise Mary's 110 years old, and wow,
this old lady sitting in the front that everybody's fawning over because she's somebody important. You could say, no, she was there. Like we all knew her, and you all know her because she's gone to these different churches in that period of time. Mary Magdalene was one of the wealthy ones that financed the whole thing.
Exactly.
Salome was one of the wealthy ones that financed the whole operation. So that wouldn't have just stopped. They would have been instrumental in continuing to finance the early church and the spread across. They would be known people, and so name dropping them lends credibility to the letter.
Okay, I'm with you. Kind of like Rufus and Alexander last week.
Right. Somebody somewhere knows these people.
Yep.
And say, oh, you know them, okay, and you know what you're talking about.
Well, that's a good point, Trent, because why mention them by name otherwise? It wouldn't really pay any dividends.
It's a distant second as far as like actual doctrinal value.
Yes.
But as a historical item, it's
okay. I'll go with that
for a reason.
Hey, Pastor, too, and I appreciate Trent's point to this extent as well. The Bible does a lot of name dropping. If it's not individuals, it's locations.
Yeah.
And it's important to value what Trent's adding right now, because, for instance, this is one of the ways that if you have a discussion with a person who's an LDS, Latter-day Saint, there's a lot of name dropping in their manuals, but none of them are historically accurate. You can't validate any of that stuff. And so that's important to know that the Bible, sometimes the Bible has named places and some people, and we have challenged that we couldn't find them. But the better our tools are to dig into the ground, our archaeology has pulled some of that stuff up. So we understood, for instance, the reference of Nineveh for a long time, but it wasn't until about 1850 that we were actually able to get Nineveh out of the ground to be able to confirm that it exists. And so the Bible's validated in that regard by the name dropping that Trent talks about. And there are other religions that claim to be Jesus oriented that can't do the same.
Indeed. Absolutely. And we continue to find them digging names out of the ground to validate some of the most obscure people in the Bible at times. So it's not just somebody that you can validate like a Pontius Pilate or something like that, for sure. Absolutely. And to your point too, the place names, we can visit a lot of those today and see those places, which adds an entirely other level of authenticity to the Word of God as well today. Well, let's look at the burial and the balance of this chapter. It's just a few verses here. It seems a lot longer, but it really isn't that long. It gets a little bit longer in a couple of the other books. Now, verse 42. Now, when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. And he brought fine linen, took him down, and wrapped him in the linen. He laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock, and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid. So, again, that Deuteronomy 21:23 says that if someone was left hanging on the tree past sundown, it defiled the land. So there was a legal reason for it there. Plus, you have the preparation day; it's getting to be the Sabbath. Then you got all that kicks in from that as well. So they had to move along. Now, when it came to somebody who'd been crucified, we get the sense that the Romans were just going to pitch him in a hole somewhere, a ditch. But they were actually fairly accommodating of families who somebody in the family died on the cross, was crucified on the cross. They were fairly accommodating of the families to take the bodies and bury them. The one case where they weren't very accommodating was if they had been accused and found guilty of treason. They didn't like that. And so, they wanted to crush that kind of thing. So it was not unusual for them to leave the body hanging up there for the birds to get and all that sort of thing. They weren't so accommodating of that. Now, here comes Joseph of Arimathea. Number one, he's not a family member. He has no relation to Jesus whatsoever. Number two, Jesus was put on the cross for treason. I mean, that's ultimately what he was up there for. And so, he's, I think I just answered my own question on that. So, oh well. Forgot I wrote that question. So anyway, he comes forward, and there's no way that he could possibly, by himself, I mean, it was the 9th hour, 3:00, right around then, to get this body off the cross, to get it all prepared for burial and get it in and close it all up. Now, we know from John, chapter 19, verse 39, that Nicodemus joined him for this, which is really interesting. Matthew notes that Joseph was a rich man. So it's been conjectured that probably had a few servants to help him. And like in many cases, maybe even Joseph may have not so much done the physical work. I hope this doesn't freak you guys out and think I'm being heretical or something. Joseph may not have done the actual physical work, but Joseph paid for the work to be done, which would have been accounted to his account, right? I mean, so whether he physically did it or whether he had people work for him do it and he paid for the work, Joseph was held responsible for it. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So, and as far as the tomb is concerned, later archaeology has shown that that tomb where he was laid was in a first century cemetery. And many of the cemeteries in those days were, because they were hewn into the rock, they were hewn into old quarries because you'd have just kind of a sheer wall, essentially, and they could put them in there. So that was kind of the idea. So I almost blew it with Joseph. I kind of gave you part of the answer, but certainly be risky for him to go and ask for the dead body of a revolutionary. That's one risky thing. What else might have been risky for Joseph to do this? Because he's kind of hanging out there pretty far. Who else might he have gotten hot water with?
Well, if he was a prominent member of the council, I'm sure the council would say, hey.
Yeah. Now, what we don't know, and there's been some discussion about it, we don't know whether this was necessarily the Sanhedrin, or it could have been one of the local councils. But regardless, he was a known and prominent and respected Jewish leader. And so him coming and asking for Jesus told us what? What would you assume if he came into
He was showing that he was a follower, that he was a believer by wanting to do that, wouldn't you say?
Seems like it to me. I mean, it says here, and you know, this is kind of a known phrase, you know, that he was waiting for the coming of God. I mean, he was, you know, had his mind set to that. But it sure seems like him coming and asking for the body and putting himself out there with Pilate says he had to be a follower of Jesus. Can't make that a certain statement, but why else would he go to that risk?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you think about that, he really was hanging out there pretty far to take Jesus and do that.
Yeah. Also, with the theme of defilement from the Torah, he's going
Right.
to deal with a dead body right before the Sabbath.
Yeah.
I mean, within minutes of sundown. So,
Yes.
I mean, if it's just the family and they're probably a bunch of losers anyway, then nobody really cares. But, you know, for somebody who's prominent and eventually on the Sanhedrin, or at least knows all the priests and talks to a lot of people and is going to see several people over the next couple of days, you know, to go and make yourself ritually unclean by dealing with death, that's a risky proposition in the culture too.
Yeah, absolutely right. And interesting that not only did he do it, but as we read in John, Nicodemus was in there doing the same thing. So they took a big risk on a lot of fronts in that regard. Other thoughts about that?
It's just very fortunate that he did do that, because Jesus passed, and I don't know if he set out what his resurrection was going to be, but coming out of a tomb is not a bad way to, it's everything staged and it's nice, so coming out of a tomb is pretty nice if you're going to come back,
Yeah.
So Joseph probably didn't have a conversation with Jesus though about setting up a tomb for him.
We don't see any of that. We know that Jesus would do some planning for other things, right? Yeah.
Right. So he has all this planning on his death, but he never spoke about, where he's going to be placed and all the details of it. So this guy, just to take courage to do it,
Yeah.
because he's willing for the kingdom, is really fortunate for our ears to hear and for us to be able to read about.
Why do you say that? Why do you think it's good for us to hear that?
Because he's willing to accept that the kingdom of God is more valuable than what's on the world. So
Yeah.
it would be an aggressive position to go get the body of Jesus at this time.
And the tomb was new. Nobody ever been in it before. So it's just they would reuse tombs, but this one was brand new. That's what John tells us. It was brand new. And so he was giving that to the Lord for his first, right? And to your point, he didn't know he's coming back in 3 days. So there's an act of service there. Maybe we kind of missed. We all know the end of the story. We know that the account. We know that Jesus is coming back, and it's just a real quick usage of the tomb. But Joseph didn't know that. So,
and one thing we don't see in Mark here, but the extra couple of lines, for example, it's in Matthew, it's his own tomb. Like he had just bought it.
Correct.
He just bought it and had it fitted out, ready to go.
Yeah.
which has a little bit of a, Roman Stoic, memento mori, remember that you're going to die idea behind it. Prepare yourself, prepare for where you're going to be laid. And he says, nope, I did this, but I'm ready for myself to be buried, but I'm going to put him in here instead. Which has a little bit of an echo of Jesus talking about, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.
Right.
But also Jesus would say, don't worry about tomorrow, for today has troubles enough of its own. It fits very well that Jesus would have made no plans. And somebody who did, who was very much in a position to do so, said, you know what? I can override my own plans here and do something that's more important.
Well, we get a sense. Go ahead, Preston.
So you posed an interesting question that we really haven't addressed, and I think Blake tackled a little bit of it, but it's an important component to consider. And the question that you posed is potentially how much trouble was Joseph of Arimathea bringing on himself? And there's a discussion among Messianic Jews and the traditional Christians of old, and this is a tradition of Christians, but it's a discussion among the Messianic Jews. Jesus. So I'm the first thing I'm going to say is not a messianic thought, but it's something to consider because of Jesus's foreknowledge. Jesus kind of planned for potentially the hullabaloo that might ensue after his death. So here's what I'm going to throw out for you to think about, because see, sometimes we read these passages in the Bible and we don't read everything holistically and recognize all of the things going on in the four Gospels. So here's the point that I'll make that helps us to recognize why perhaps Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and maybe even a couple of other folks from the Sanhedrin who were Jesus believers didn't catch a whole lot of heck with this. The tradition in Messianic Jews talk about the fact that right now the Sanhedrin, as this is going on, has their hands full interviewing people who were dead, but now they're alive. So they are trying to interview these people along with Lazarus to discover where they were, where they've been, and what's going on now, and potentially what's going to happen. And that doesn't end in a short period of time. That takes a period of time. And the Romans aren't necessarily eager to address this because that's not a part of their issue to address. But the Jews who are in the know and the ruling council of the Jews, they want answers, and they're corralling these people as best as they can and interviewing them, conversing with them. And they're not worried right now about what happened to Jesus so much and the aftermath because Jesus is already dead.
All right. Well, that certainly that's kind of a logic exercise. It's pretty extra biblical for what it's worth, but it's a logic exercise. And it's almost, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it the way I'm thinking it. It's almost like a diversionary tactic. I mean, that's what it kind of feels like the way you just described it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying is you got this thing going on over here that requires so much attention that this thing that's extraordinary also is not getting as much import. Correct.
Well, okay. I guess I kind of line up and I get, the Messianic Jews and all that, they're Jewish and they got a little bit of read maybe on the Old Testament than I do, but I guess the way that I always learned, how to exegete scriptures, you kind of, and I've probably broken this rule a few times this year, but you tend to, you give force to the same things that have force in the passages. So I don't know that I would. I mean, Matthew makes the only guy that makes reference to it, and it kind of just comes and goes. So I don't know. I mean, they may be exactly right, but then again, they may be exactly wrong. How long did they stay alive? How long did they?
Yeah, I mean,
go
again,
back to the tomb. I mean, you can't know those things.
Right, and I'm telling you tradition stuff and what the conversation is among the Messianic Jews because, for the most part, they had to die again. So we don't know how long they were around, right? But,
Right. I mean, did they go back in at night and they didn't come back? I mean, we just don't know that.
Right. And so I'm not necessarily saying that that's the truism, but I am saying it's a logic kind of conundrum of sorts, is to take a look at what it is that is potential. What I've learned, though, from hanging out with Messianic Jews is when we go back and we ask questions, say, about Genesis 3, and we say Genesis 3:15, did you understand that differently than I do as a Christian? And when they explain it, they show me that there's things I don't understand as a Christian evangelical who's had that kind of teaching all my life. There's things they understood about it differently. And that's all.
Because of
That's
the
the
Old
only reason I'm
Testament.
throwing that out there.
Because of the Torah.
Correct.
They're teaching through the Torah. So I say,
Correct.
I think when we get to the New Testament, though, I think we're on we're not on equal footing, but I think we're much more equal footing than we would be in the Hebrew. It's just kind of where I'm living. So not to throw any shade on anybody. I just, at that point, you're kind of, you think about, you brought back up Joseph, right? I mean, we find out from, is it Luke? In Luke, that, that he had not consented to their decision to do away with Jesus. So he was pretty outspoken about that, at least in some circles, whether he was with the Sanhedrin or whether he was a local council guy. He had let his position be known that he was not in favor of Jesus's death. So he'd already kind of staked out a contrary position, a minority position. So he seemed to me like he was walking on thin ice anyway. And we don't know what happened to him after all of this either. So, but I like the idea that you're interviewing dead people, but that's or risen people. That's, as much as I'm fighting you on it, it's a pretty cool scenario.
Well, in the case of this, everything went right. In the case of now, that as we see it, right? Because we're reading it and we understand it. That all of that is correct that happened. So where would the fear lie in a sense? Because we can't necessarily touch upon it. But what is good is that one who is expecting the kingdom of the Lord is the one who's courageous in all of this. Everyone else is on the reacting to world pushes and the air, principalities of the air, basically.
Sure.
Everyone's actions are on this, except for the one here who is dwelling on the kingdom of God,
Right.
has the courage in this act, because these actions are all correct and they're right. So he can interpret it, or not that. Anyways, he has an opportunity there to act upon that courageously because it's going to be viewed, or he wouldn't understand it all the way, but just the knowing of the kingdom of God to be coming and waiting for that is of spiritual importance, but also it's very important just to handle basic fact or get things basically done.
Okay.
The right way of getting things done.
Well, I think I'm reading you is that, he had a spirit of obedience to the Lord. He was trying to be in line with the Lord's will. When I see that waiting for the kingdom of God, I'm reminded of Simeon that we read in Jesus when he came they brought him to the temple for his dedication and his thank you. Circumcision, that they talked about Simeon being a just and devout man waiting for the consolation of Israel. It's got that same kind of language there, and the Holy Spirit was upon him, that kind of thing. So, any other thoughts about Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus or any of that?
Well, Pilate also had his wife who didn't like anything about it beforehand, right? His wife.
She just said, "Stay away from him. Just stay away from it." She had a dream.
This is not going good. And then you have the centurion, who probably has nothing to do with it except for at the end has witnessed the last breath. Truly, this was the Son of God. And then he's summoned by Pilate. That centurion is
Correct, which you're going to get to in a minute.
right. So we're talking about faith leading to, is that a faith leading to salvation? Maybe not, but a witness
Definitely a witness.
Yeah, to the glory of God, absolutely. So those two having that coming together, but then it takes the man who knows the kingdom of God is coming or is expecting it to be courageous. And so those three came together to make that happen, to get him into the tomb.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's words there. Truly, he's the Son of God. And then you got Pilate summoning those words up, and then you got Joseph acting out of nothing, of knowing that that two was going to be made together. Just courage.
He obviously he obviously at least believed Jesus to be a holy and righteous man, not worthy of death.
Yeah.
You know, beyond that, we can't truly know that.
Yeah, so where he winds up would be good. If he's in a good place, then sure, we'll send him there.
Well, so we come to Pilate, and it says, oh, where am I? I'm thank you. He comes to Pilate, Joseph comes to Pilate, and it says that he marveled that Jesus was already dead, and he summoned the centurion, and he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Okay, that's Pilate's response. What do we learn from that? What do we learn from that action? What does this tell you about Pilate and what all has gone on in this last chapter and a half?
Well, basically, once he had received confirmation from the centurion, right, that Jesus was dead, and he turned the body over to Joseph, then at that point, the Romans would consider Jesus, officially dead at that point. So then it was off of Pilate's hands. He didn't have anything to do with it after that.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I think that gets us part of the way there. Because that would be, kind of almost like a death certificate to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
But let's take it a little bit further. What else do we read into this?
Seems like Pilate has a trend of compassion because he wanted to acquit Jesus from the get-go. Now he's amenable to surrendering his body right away without issue.
Okay.
I was thinking he sounds like he's been kind of officious and bureaucratic up to this point. Just, you know what? I don't even know what all this is about. Why are you guys even bringing this to me? Let's just get this over with. He's expecting us to be an agonizing 3-day ordeal. It's going to be like all the others, whatever. What? He's already dead? This is something different.
Not this Jesus again.
I mean, he doesn't really have any attachment one way or another. He probably didn't even believe any of the rabble rouser, traitor revolutionary talk. He just says, I got to just do something to get this off my plate. And just got it over with. And then when it doesn't go as normal, that's when he sits up and takes notice. But all along, he doesn't have any major commitment to the trial, the outcome.
Well, you
As
kind of
a
hit on
political
two.
viewpoint.
It's kind of like two layers there, right? There's the kind of the disconnection of the Romans to especially this Roman to the Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, guys, it's a job. It's a job. And he's got to put up with the Jews. He doesn't like them. We talked about that last week or week before last. He's not a big fan of the Jews. They're all their weird little religion, and I'm talking from his perspective, right? Their weird little religion, all the stuff they do, and then you got this whole intrigue with the Sanhedrin, and and threatening him, and all that sort of thing.
It doesn't
seems-
cost him anything to be compassionate.
It doesn't, not at all. But if word gets back to Rome, right, that that guy, we're not sure about him. it seems to me that Pilate would have to defend his actions to a point to say, I sent the guy to death. He's just another poor Jewish guy from Galilee. I sent him to death. I don't think he was really guilty. I don't know if he could get in trouble for that either. That'd be a miscarriage of justice. But did people really care about the Jews? They were a thorn in Rome's flesh. I mean, they were just a thorn, or not a thorn in flesh, thorn in their side, for years. And eventually they got pounded about 40 years later. But it seems like, to your point about compassion, I get it. Larry saying, yeah, he's dead. It's like it's done. Probably shouldn't have done it in the first place, but can't change it now. So let's give his body away, and to your point, Trent, let's be done with this. Need to go ahead and close the book.
Yeah.
And move on. But there's a pretty good thread of scholarship that people see this compassion, to use your word, on Pilate's part, that he probably wasn't real committed to having him crucified in the first place. And we kind of see that in the other accounts, right? I mean, he fought with it. You brought it up, Blake, about the wife saying, you need to just stay away from this. This is not a good thing. So it seems like in his last act that we read in the gospel, Pilate shows himself to be a bit human, but for perhaps self-serving purposes too. For what it's worth, he wanted to kind of assuage his guilt a bit for putting to death a man that he may not have believed was actually guilty.
I mean, you could almost preach on how this is a picture of, oh, well, I have my harmless little pet vice that I just kind of, it's there in the background. It's just part of who I am. I'm just made that way, but it's not hurting anybody really. I mean, it helps me do my job. And then when it comes to the point of it, your God comes for you, calls you by name, and you just say, nah, I'm going to hang on to this little thing over here. Almost get a picture. I don't know if anybody's read the Chronicles of Narnia books. I'm just reading them to Archer right now, and there's this one passage in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader where the cousin Eustace he's been pretty horrible, but he's a little kid. He's a snot-nosed brat, whatever. He turns into a dragon because his greed and his selfishness finally just overcome everything. And yeah, it's all fairy tale type stuff. But then Aslan, the lion, who's supposed to be Jesus, comes to rescue him basically and says, hey, you need to take these scales off, this dragon skin. He tries to take it off, but the next layer underneath is the same thing. He tries to take it off, and the next layer is the same thing. Takes it off a third time, and the next layer is the same thing. It feels good like a scab coming off, but it's not really leaving. He's still in the same position he was. So Aslan says, you'd better let me do it. Lies down, takes a giant lion claw and just rips it open and pulls him out. And he's raw at first. He's surprised. It kind of hurts. And then, he throws him in a lake and washes him off, and his normal skin is restored, and he's happy to be back pure again. There's kind of this picture of, you need Jesus to come really pull the scales off of you, pick that scab away completely to get the real healing. So you could almost preach that about, hey, Pilate, and even this guy that, I don't know if he ever actually believed any of it, but it went from just his little harmless vice suddenly becoming this huge, horrible situation. And yeah, needed to happen as part of the plan. But when God comes for him afterward, if that's what's going on here, that realization that God can bring to you is more than what you could just pick off for yourself.
Okay.
This was floating around that who brought him to Pilate has the greater sin than Pilate. And then this is the second one. Now in his death, he comes to Pilate again, in the sense, only there is no sin now coming to him because he's dead.
Okay.
So the centurion, so Joseph requesting something of Jesus, to be taken and used over here, just like the one who gave him into the hands of Pilate.
Yeah.
There was sin involved in that. And on the death, there's not. And so he's buried during this time. So this is just the culmination that Pilate does have another say over him again, only he's dead. And then the one coming to him doesn't have sin anymore.
Okay.
So instead, it goes to a correct place where the resurrection is going to happen. You know what I mean? So anyways, so there's two instances where Pilate receives some authority to be granted dealing with Jesus.
Okay.
One is with sin, one is without sin.
I have to process that one, Blake. There's something there, but I gotta process that one. I thought you were going to say something more to the effect that the decision the second time didn't matter because he was dead.
Yeah, yeah, just well, in a very worldly, yeah, just go for it, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It does bring in a good point, though, that, for whatever reason God needed it this exact way, Jesus had to go into that tomb at that particular time.
Sure.
Fulfill the prophecy of Jonah to be in the belly for 3 days and then come out. He couldn't just kind of get thrown on the trash heap for a couple of days until we can figure out what to do with him.
Right.
So Pilate, as a semi-conscious instrument, didn't even know what part he was playing, but it had to happen that way.
He was a tool kind of throughout, wasn't he?
Yeah.
All right, guys, I'm going to stop there. Oh, Pilate. Tell you what. Next week we finish this book, lesson 39, and I'm going to just kind of give you a preview right now where we're going to probably hit the rough spot next week. If you look at your Bible, there is probably something around verse 9. Mine says this: verses 9 through 20 are bracketed in the NU text as not original. They are lacking in Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, although nearly all other manuscripts of Mark contain them. You probably got something like that in yours. You've got some variation of that. The NIV, I think, sometimes will even kind of separate it even more. So really, a lot of the earliest and best manuscripts stop at 8. They stop at 8. So, and we'll talk about 9 through 20, but I'm going to focus on 1 through 8 next week, and we'll talk about why maybe 9 through 20 don't belong, and there's a lot of good reasons why it doesn't. And so. If it does stop, I've preached this. You guys go, if I preach a sermon about this, that if it stops at 8, there's a good reason why. And I'm going to kind of retread that a little bit next week. But I would encourage you to, read 16, look at it, see what you think on that. If you've got some study notes, check it out. And kind of see. And I'll kind of bring you the pros and the cons on that next week. I'm not trying to get anybody stirred up or think they got to start tearing pages out of their Bible or anything. But the reality is, I think we need to recognize the fact that I say this all the time: that the Bible in its original autographs is without error. A lot of stuff has happened over the years, and interestingly enough, though, we can correlate 99% of biblical text either by the preponderance of different manuscripts that are out there. Sometimes they're small snippets, sometimes they're full pages. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, everybody said, here it is, here's where they're going to find out that this isn't right and that this stuff's all been cooked up. But the passages that correlate to our scriptures, they correlate just about perfectly. And then on top of that, you've got all the different guys from the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries who are writing about the Bible and quoting scriptures, passages from the Bible, and they correlate as well. But one of the challenges is that this latter part of Mark is absent in many of those cases. So we'll talk about that next week, see where you guys kind of land. But I hate to end 39 lessons into this thing, and I'm going to end in a controversy, but there you go. That's how it works. So we'll do that next week, Mark chapter 16.